When God says something, he means it. And when he makes a promise, he keeps it. That is all I want you to get today, okay? I'll say it again. When God says something, he means it. When he makes a promise, he keeps it. Now, obviously, we're going to unpack that, but that's the message. That's what I want to reflect on with you today. When we think about God's faithfulness, what we're talking about is the fact that when God speaks, it's never a careless word. It is wholeheartedly meant. It is real. And when he makes a promise, he never breaks it. And this is one of those things that we need to come back to because it's jarring. We're not used to people operating this way. As human beings, we don't always mean what we say. How many times has somebody asked you, like, hey, does this outfit look good on me? And you're like, yes, great. Right? We sometimes say what we think people want to say, or for our advantage. We have a lot of great politicians who care a lot. We've probably had a few politicians who don't always mean what they say, right? We live in a time where we have to be skeptical of so many people because we don't always know when they say something, do you actually mean it? Are you just saying that to get me to move on? Are you just saying sorry so I'll quit bugging you? Or when people make a promise, are you actually going to keep that? That's a pretty big promise. I'm not sure. And it gets even more amplified with God because with God, the things he says are much bigger than the things we typically say. They carry much more weight. And so whether or not he means these things is incredibly important. Likewise, the promises he makes are much bigger than the promises we typically make. The promises we cling to from God are not, I'll get that report to you by 4 p.m. today. Like, you make that promise and you may or may not keep it, but God's promises have huge consequences for how we live this life. They have huge consequences for what we think is going to happen when we die and beyond. And so today what we're talking about is the fact that when God says something, he means it. And when he makes a promise, he keeps it. And this is helpful for us no matter what stage of your walk with Jesus you're in. If you are somebody who maybe Christianity, it's fine, it's cool, maybe you're skeptical, maybe you're like, I'm fine with it, but there's a lot of different things, or I just kind of loosely hold on to it because it makes me feel good. The words that Jesus says to us, if you're in that camp, have immense importance on maybe this is worth more than I'm giving it. Maybe this matters more than I treat it. Now, if you're somebody who is a Christian, but you're going through the trenches of life, and there's all sorts of doubts, I feel that. And this is a reminder that even though it doesn't always feel like it, what God has said and what he has promised, he's good for. And for those of us, if you're a Christian and life is going good, and when you were sharing earlier, when AJ had us share what you're thankful for this week, and you're like, man, there's so many good things, and I'm really grateful how life is, that's awesome. This is still a reminder to us because life's not always going to look that way. And so we need to go over and over again to remind ourselves that God's word is true, it's faithful, what he says he means, what he promises he keeps. That's what we're talking about today. And what we've been doing in this series is we've been looking through the life of Joseph. Joseph is this wonderful servant of God. He's not perfect by no means. If you've seen the story, he's had his ups and downs. But in the life of Joseph, what we get to get a glimpse of is God's working through him and in his life. And today we're looking at God's faithfulness in Joseph's life and in the life of Joseph's dad, Jacob. And so we're going to look at how God has been faithful to both of those men, despite their shortcomings, despite the circumstances, how he has been true to what he has said and what he has promised. Now, where we just left off, it's just a brief recap, is that God sent Joseph, Joseph was handed over by his brothers, sold into slavery to Egypt. He rose to a prominent place. His family, back up north, they were suffering in a famine. They send some brothers down to get some food. Joseph messed with them for a while. Long story short, Joseph eventually reveals himself to his brothers and says, it's me, your brother, who sold to Egypt. It's my father alive. Go tell him what's happened. Go tell him where I am and bring him back down here. I'll make sure I take care of you and your family. So Joseph's brothers go back up and they tell their dad, hey, your son Joseph's alive. And Jacob's just like stunned. It says he went numb. He just like kind of was in shock, but eventually kind of came to. And so what we're looking at today is the aftermath of what happens with Jacob and then going down to visit Joseph. So this is in Genesis chapter 46. So Jacob, or is also known as Israel, has been told your son Joseph is alive, and then God's going to come speak to him. This is chapter 6, verse 2 through 4. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and will also bring you up again. And Joseph's hands shall close your eyes. So Jacob, he's been a sojourner. He hasn't really had a home, but this is where he's been dwelling. This is where he's been living. And so now he finds out that his son Joseph is alive, and God reassures him, it's okay. Go down to Egypt, take your family, and I'm going to do this great thing. I'm going to make you into a great nation. And this almost beautiful picture of just the peace that he's going to experience. That this son that you thought you lost is actually going to be the one when you die to close your eyes for you, right? This reuniting. So you jump forward in chapter 46. This is when they actually go down. So he, that is Jacob, had sent Judah, that's one of his other sons, ahead of him to Joseph to show the way before him in Goshen. And they came into the land of Goshen. Then Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel, his father, in Goshen. He presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck for a good while. Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive. So Jacob sends Judah ahead of time, hey, go let Joseph know we're coming. Again, this is a long journey. This is probably multiple weeks, so let Joseph know we're on our way. So Judah runs off ahead. And then eventually Joseph meets his father, this reuniting. They thought they lost each other forever, and just this beautiful picture of just weeping on one another for a good while. I like that language. Who knows, just for a good while. They cry, they're reunited. And then Jacob, or also known as Israel, says, it's like, you know what, let me die. This is all I needed, was to see you and know that you're alive. This is it. And so what you have here in chapter 46, and we'll look at 47 in a little bit, is this beautiful picture of some fulfillment, of promises kept. Because if you go back, Joseph has gone through a lot. But the story of Joseph that we've been walking through started with some promises from God. So if you remember, Joseph starts with these dreams that God gave him, where he sees these bundles of wheat bowing down to him, and his wheat is exalted above his brothers. And then he sees the stars in this dream, and all the other stars, and even the sun and the moon bow down to his star. And so God had promised that he was going to do something great in his life. And then what happened? His brothers turned on him and sold him off. Now, at any point in Joseph's story, it would have been very plausible to think that that is one promise that isn't going to be kept. All right, God's been good to me still, but what he told me he was going to do, I don't see how that's going to happen at this point. I like to picture, and again, we're not told this in Scripture, this is just how I think. Again, this is a multiple weeks journey to Egypt. Like, there's a period where Joseph is just been handed over by his brothers, and he thinks he's leaving his land, his people forever. And he's walking, probably bound for days' journeys, right? And I picture Joseph sitting there at night, just reflecting. And there's no lights. He's looking up at the stars. And he's thinking back to this dream. God, you said you were going to lift me up and exalt and do these great things. Now I'm in shackles. I don't know when I'm going to see anyone I know ever again. In the trenches of life, it did not look like God was keeping his promise. It did not look like God was being faithful. Even when he gets to Egypt, Joseph has all these things, and God is with him and blesses him, but then as soon as he does something well, then he's framed for something and thrown in jail. And then he helps somebody, and the guy forgets about him. And so nothing in Joseph's life screams, God is keeping his promise, until you zoom out and see now in this moment where Joseph gets to hug his father and see the full picture. All of a sudden, the promise is seen and kept. Likewise, if you look at Jacob is Joseph's dad. Jacob also had promises made to him. So if you go back farther than we've been looking in this story, at one point Jacob, he's kind of a scoundrel. He's a little bit of a rascal. Jacob steals his brother's birthright, and he steals his brother's blessing from his father. And his brother wants to kill him for it, so Jacob goes on the run. He takes off for hiding because his brother quite literally wants to kill him. So he's on the run, and at one point he takes a nap, and he sleeps. He's so tired on this rock, and he gets this vision, and the Lord speaks to him. He sees these angels going up and down in this kind of staircase or ladder to heaven. And then we're told this, and behold, the Lord stood above it, that is this ladder, and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." So that was Jacob's promise from God, right? I am going to make a great nation out of you. Your descendants, I love this language, shall be like the dust of the earth. How much dust is in the earth? A lot. I don't know. If you know that, you should have been at trivia last night. That would have been a helpful tidbit. How much dust? A lot, right? How much your offspring? It's going to be this huge. It's just going to be wonderful and expansive. Now, for a while, it looks good because, Jacob, he ends up having 12 sons, and he has at least one daughter, probably multiple. So it's like, oh yeah, the family's growing. But then in Joseph's story, what's been happening to Jacob's family? It's been shrinking. Joseph, his favorite child, he thinks is dead by a wild animal. He's gone. Then when he sends his sons to get food, they don't come back with the second oldest, Simeon. He's left in jail down in Egypt, right? I thought my family was supposed to, God, you promised me my family was going to grow and explode and be this great nation. All I'm seeing is I'm losing people instead. And you think about dust, Jacob, most of this story has been in a famine. How many times there is he mourning the loss of his children? He's just staring at dust blowing through the wind, thinking, where'd that promise go? In the trenches of life, it's hard to see God's faithfulness. It's not always easy to see that God actually means what he says, and then when he makes promises, he keeps them. Because life is not this perfect linear line of like, all right, I'm going to do this, and then, 10% of the way there, 20% of the way, 30%, there's the promise. Great, love it. It's winding, it's messy. We live in a broken world. And so often, we have to look at stories like Jacob's and Joseph's to remind ourselves that this is a God who, although the circumstances don't look like God's being faithful, in the end, he is. Right? In the end, God keeps his word, which is why you need a full view of things. You need a big picture. And so I love this. When you think of a lifetime, we get to see the end of Jacob's life, or approaching the end here. This is jumping forward to chapter 47. So Pharaoh, who Joseph works for, says to him, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock." So Pharaoh is pleased with Joseph. He says, hey, I'm glad your family's here. Give them the best of the land. Prepare a good space for them. And if there's anyone who can work, give them charge of my livestock. And as we approach the end here of Jacob's life, and Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. He lived an old life. But here's what I want to point out. There's about a 60-year gap between when God said, I'm going to make your descendants as great as the dust, and when he reunites with Joseph. 60 years. 60 years which he could say, I don't know if God's keeping this promise. And it's only at the very end of it that it's like, oh no, he was faithful the whole time. It didn't look like it, but there he was. Jacob's kind of story is going to kind of wrap up here. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh, that's a way of making a promise in this day, and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. And Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. Right, so right before he comes down, this is a 17-year promise. It's a little bit quicker. Says, go down. I will take care of your family down there. And you will come back to this promised land. And so Jacob gets to see the fulfillment of that through his son Joseph. And Joseph's going to be able to be there when he dies. But the thing I want to point out is that when you're judging one's faithfulness, whether somebody is true to their word, whether they mean what they say, whether they keep their promises, you need a much larger screenshot of it. If you're so zoomed in, it's hard to see. This is like a mural, right? If you ever stood like this far from a painting, like a giant, like 30-foot painting, it just blurs. And it's only when you can step back you see what was happening all along. So for instance, when a husband pledges to be faithful to his wife on their wedding, if you were to just like jump to like a week later and be like, is this a faithful husband, right? Like, I think so. Like, seems like it, right? To actually judge whether he's a faithful husband, you probably need to see their entire marriage, right? Now, there's clues and hints along the way that could point you in the right direction, but you need a much bigger shot, right? If I promise you, hey, as a friend, I'm going to be there for you through thick and thin, and the second you go through something, I'm not there immediately, is he faithful to that promise? I don't know. You zoom out, oh, no, he's on his way. Help is coming. And so this is so important because, as I said, one's faithfulness must be judged by looking at the whole story. When you are so close, and when you're, like I said, the trenches, right? When you are in the mud and the muck of life, it's hard to see the big picture, which is why it's so helpful to take a look back, just take a step back and look, which is also why it's helpful to remember our own lives. I love this about the Christian church. You have people who are new to the faith who remind others who are longtime Christians what it's like to experience this for the first time, the joys and the restoration and the pure hope that comes with it. And on the same side, you have those who have been walking with Jesus for a long time who can remind those who are newer to the faith, hey, I've seen God's faithfulness play out. I've seen his working. And I've been where you've been, and let me tell you how God carried me through it. This is also why we have the Bible, because it's a collection of stories, it's a collection of things that happen in life, a big picture view of God's faithfulness. Take a step back. Jacob's life, 60-year gap, when one promise was made, when he got to see it happen. Other people, their promises were filled after their lifetime. And so it helps to be able to look big picture. And the story of God's dealing starts when he first spoke the world into existence, when he used his words, and he meant it, right? When he first promised to care for this creation. And it goes on and on and on until he returns. And so it's a big picture. And so you have to look at the whole thing to understand how faithful he is. And I bring this up because I just, if you are going through something, I get it when things don't look like God is keeping his word. That is normal. And every hero of the faith that we look at in the Bible probably went through something similar. And this is just an encouragement to say, God has gone through this before and he has always been true. When God says something, he means it. When he promises something, he keeps it. And so this should help encourage us. It should strengthen us. It should frame how we think about what we're going through. Because God is so good that he does not wait for us to get our stuff together. He does not wait for you to do something to then be faithful. We often operate with like a tit-for-tat operation. Like, you're nice to me, I'll be nice to you. Tit for tat, right? You're faithful to me, you kept your word, all right, now I'll be faithful to you, right? That's not how God works. Because God's faithfulness goes long before you could ever do anything. God was faithful to you when he decided to create you, to make you. Right? He was faithful to you when he formed you and he gave you your family and he gave you your abilities and your skills. He's been faithful the whole time, long before you were ever born. Right? Because he's been around a lot longer. And so God's faithfulness does not depend on something from us. Sometimes we feel like I need to do something for then God to keep that promise. God has spoken all these good things to me. If I can just work hard enough, pray hard enough, be good enough, then God will say, all right, here's those gifts I wanted to give you. But rather, God's faithfulness precedes our faith, right? God's faithfulness comes first. So God is faithful and good and just. He keeps his word, which then enables us to go, wow, this is a faithful God. I can believe in him. I can trust him. And this is where Christianity is not a blind faith. Christianity is not an email saying, hey, you've been chosen to win a $100 Amazon gift card. Trust me, click here. Right? That sounds great. God has a track record. God has done things. He does not ask you to say, hey, I know life's tough, so why not take a shot at this? Might as well. But rather, God says, hey, look at what I've done. Look how I was faithful to Jacob. Did Jacob deserve it? No. Did Joseph deserve the faithfulness God showed to him? No. Nobody did. And yet God was faithful over and over and over again. And so he invites us to reflect on these stories and to say, look at how I've been faithful. Look how I've been faithful to my people. Look how I've been faithful to you. I'm not waiting for you to figure this out. I've already been faithful. I'm here for you. And now I'm inviting you to trust me. Right? Put him to the test, right? Not actually, but put that track record. Look back, reflect on it. And ultimately, this is where God was willing to stake everything on one single promise, right? All of the things that he's ever said, all of the words that he's ever spoken, he was willing to say, I mean what I say, I keep what I promise, and to show you, I'm going to hinge everything on one single word, one single promise. And it's going to come from his word, which is also his son, Jesus. You see, Jesus did a lot of things, and he spoke a lot of words. Some people said, I think this guy means it. Some people said, I don't think he means it. He made a lot of promises. Some people said, I think he's going to keep this promise. Some people said, I don't think he's going to keep this promise. But ultimately, Jesus hinges everything that we read in the Bible, everything about God, everything that he means, that he embodies, on one promise. He says, I'm going to let myself die, and I promise you I'm going to come back in 3 days. And if I don't keep that, none of my words mean anything, and none of my promises will be kept. Calls us shut. One promise, one word. He says this over and over again. This is in the Gospel of Luke. This is the third time he tells his disciples this in the Gospel of Luke. Right, and after taking the 12, he said to them, see, we are going to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. For he will be delivered over to the Gentiles and will be mocked and shamefully treated and spit upon. And after flogging him, they will kill him, and on the third day he will rise. So to everything he says, he's like, this is the one thing. If you don't see me in 3 days, it's all a sham. Everything that God has said, don't believe it, right? Is there even a God if this doesn't happen? That's the weight that he puts on this singular promise. If Jesus didn't keep this promise, we are all wasting our time here. There's a lot of places with a pretty good brunch that we could be sitting at right now. We much better spent time. We could have been sleeping in, whatever. Would he keep this promise? What's crazy, this is, again, when in the thick of life, the trenches, it's hard to see. How many of his disciples, after Jesus died, believed, don't worry, he's coming back in 3 days? None of them. They mourned. And in fact, when Jesus does rise, they still don't get it right away. On the road to Emmaus, Jesus is walking, but he's concealed himself. Two of his disciples are there. They don't even know it's him. And he's like, what's going on? What's wrong? Like, are you the only one who didn't hear about this Jesus of Nazareth guy? Man. And this is what they say. We had hoped that he was the promised one. They did not say we were hoping. We had hoped. That hope is gone. In the trenches, when he died, everyone thought that promise was not kept. I guess this guy didn't mean what he said. When he said he was the way, the truth, and life, when he said he was the Son of God, when he said that whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. But then he appeared. And all of a sudden, people saw that this was a promise kept. And people believed and they proclaimed the word. And on account of those witnesses, it spread and spread and spread. And so everything that we read about God's faithfulness comes back to this single promise. This is why we build up to Easter every year, right? Everything hinges on it. And it's because of Easter that we can say that God means what he says and he keeps what he promises. It all comes back to the resurrection of Jesus. Because Jesus has said a lot of things, and God has said a lot of things. But if you want to see his faithfulness, you have to see his willingness to even go into death, promising to come back out. And believing that, and believing the people who saw it and heard it and believed it to be true and have spoken it to you, we now can believe everything he says, right? So we can, with the same confidence, knowing that Jesus has promised to die and rise, has done so, everything Jesus says, we know when he says something, he means it. When he promises something, he keeps it. Right? And so when we look at all of what God says, again, if I want you to get one thing, when God says something, he means it. It's not a careless word. It's not just, oh, whatever. Wholeheartedly, with the weight of one who can speak a world into existence, he speaks words that he means. And when he makes a promise, with the same promise that he would overcome death itself, the promises he makes are certain and he keeps them. And here's where this makes such a difference, because if you believe this, if you believe that God means what he says and he keeps what he promises, it's going to completely shape how you live your entire life. Because the things that matter, the things that have priority, the things that seem important, are going to be completely changed by what God says are important, what he says matters. What he says, these are the things with eternal consequences. Here's a few examples. If you believe God means what he says, then when he says, worry not about adorning yourself externally and the external beauty that the world praises, but actually care about the internal beauty of the heart that never fades, I'm going to spend a totally different amount of time on which one I'm focusing on. How do I look, or how's my heart? And I'm going to spend a totally different amount of time valuing how I am if I'm so worried about how the world tells me I appear versus what God has done in here. Another example, if I believe that God means what he says, and he keeps his promises, when he says, I promise you, I'm the one who's keeping this world together, I'm the one who's going to keep it turning, don't worry. And so what I want you to do is I want you to rest. I don't want you running around nonstop, busy, because you were made to rest and to enjoy this world. I want you to disconnect from just the constant distraction and just enjoy this creation I've made and enjoy the people I've put into your life and spend time reading and praying and talking to me. And you know what? When you plug back in, the world's still going to be turning. He promised that. And I trust that he's going to keep it. If he means what he says, then I trust him when he says through his apostle Paul that you can even rejoice when you're suffering. Because suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And this hope will not let you down. And so even in the midst of suffering, I can hold on to the fact that I can rejoice. Because this is a hope worth hanging on to. This should also stir in us a desire. I want to know what he says. If he means all this stuff, give it to me all. I want to know it. I want to read it. I want to hear it. I want to think about it. What are these promises? What are these words? Because ultimately, we have a God who is faithful. And in looking at Jacob and Joseph's story, we don't do this so we can be like, wow, how cool Joseph is. Joseph is an opportunity to see, wow, how faithful is this God? How wonderful, faithful. This God who says things that he means and he makes promises that he keeps. And if you leave here with nothing else, know that in Jesus, God said, I love you. I'll do anything I can to be with you, to have you be my child, because I care. I want life for you. I want what's best for you. And Jesus, God said, I will pay any cost to make you mine. And when he said that, he meant it. Amen.